That is so exciting. That gets me so excited. Oh God, the fact that we have scratched the surface. But do you think that we are going to find new terpenes, or are we going to find just more expressive terpenes, the ones we already have?
Will we find new terpenes? I would say yes, because if you look at the biosynthetic logic for how terpenes are actually made, there's a term used, promiscuity. Usually, when we have in like biosynthetic pathways, it's much like a worker at a factory works on one piece, and then once that one piece is made, it goes on to the next worker, and then they bolt in something else. So it's template driven. It's very predictable, very reliable. You find this type of stuff all over in biology. Terpene biosynthesis is not like that at all. It's very promiscuous. You could have one substrate become multiple products. You could have one enzyme acting on one substrate and it produces multiple products. There's sometimes a ratio between the two of them. Other times there's not. So this whole thing is just kind of a crapshoot. So the way that terpene biosynthesis happens allows for remarkable flexibility. This is why you can have 70,000 different metabolites that are produced, but you don't have 70,000 different synthase enzymes. How much information is required to actually create those synthase enzymes versus the molecules that are required? In order for the plants to produce, let's just say hypothetically, it was one enzyme produced one terpene. We would need like 70,000 enzymes to produce 70,000 terpenes. It's not a very advantageous strategy for plants. So across evolutionary time, they kind of figured out like, hey, if I have some plasticity, if I have some flexibility, I can have this one synthase enzyme that I can depend on. I can produce it, but this one synthase enzyme can take a substrate or maybe even multiple substrates and produce multiple products. And this is a very unique, a very unusual feature. And this is specifically why we see terpenes as being one of the most remarkably expressive categories of natural products. There's like 70,000, maybe there's over 100,000 that are known right now, but some of them you wouldn't even recognize. For example, chlorophyll, there's the head group, the porphyrin ring that the magnesium sits in, and then you see the nitrogen around it. You ever seen that funny looking tail on the bottom end? It almost looks like a little squiggly. That's phytol. That's a diterpene. There's another terpene called gibberellin. Gibberellins are growth hormones. I'm sure you guys have heard of those, right? Nobody knows that it's a terpene. Well, I should say not nobody. There are people that know that it's
not as commonly known.
Yeah, these are the kinds of things that you like. Once you start to realize how important terpenes are for primary metabolism, in terms of just signaling and photosynthesis, even. I mean, phytol anchors chlorophyll to the chloroplast, so it's like very, very important. And then even for human biology, terpenes are very important. They can be medicines, they can be signaling compounds. So they're not always secondary metabolites. Terpenes can very much so be in the business of primary metabolism. They could be hormones for plants. They can be involved with photosynthesis, and they can also be the products of photosynthesis too.
I think that's the fascinating thing when you look at where this plant is the science is just catching up with a lot of what, other obviously industries have had medicinal properties and stuff. It's just to the point where there hasn't been enough free will for testing for science to see some of these things. People who weren't necessarily dealing, with herb were more scrutinized and afraid to be able to get into this. So I could only imagine where things go from 20 years from now. The problem is the commercialization of the plant makes it so it's more of a small niche of people who want these organic inputs and these things that are natural because they'd rather just synthesize it in a lab and make it super, super cheap and profitable. That's where it worries me that they're dumbing down these genetics because they're being also bred sometimes in these conditions. So it's like these genotypes are kind of locked in, but then again, the recessive traits that we can find, because a lot of them we're not looking at land races. We're looking at genetics that have been bred so many times out. So if us home growers or small scale growers can take it and try some of these different applications, it's amazing to see what we could find out of this.
Yeah. And I think on the breeding side, at least, the whole plant is medicinal. It's not just the compounds that are present inside of the flowers. So I could see in the future people breeding these plants specifically for the flavonoids that are produced in the leaves, and then harvesting the leaves and dehydrating them in exactly the same way that you would make an oolong, which is very, very labor intensive, by the way. It's not just like you put it in the, freeze dryer and call it a day. There's a little bit of work required, but I can see the flavonoid profile of this plant being remarkably useful. The roots themselves also produce compounds that are highly, highly useful for certain aggressive types of cancer. It's been discovered recently. So my point is, it's the whole plant that's medicinal. Most people just think it's the medicinal compounds are concentrated in the flowers, and that's the thing to focus on. But the truth is, no, man, we have all these wonderful compounds that the leaves are capable of producing, which do not show up in the flowers at all. We may have some flavonoids that are present, but very, very few. We've got some enzymes associated with flavonoid chemistry present in trichome heads, but they're not producing flavonoids. They can to some extent, but they're not like, this isn't a major export for them. You have seen, I'm sure you guys have seen like the purple pigments, the anthocyanins that can sometimes come up through the stalks.
Yeah.
So you do get some of that as a photoprotective effect, but by and large, the goal is to produce a different class of compounds within the trichome heads than those that exist in the leaves. Now, in the leaves, you may have compounds that you can brew up into a tea and then drink and get the medical effects from that. But most of the other compounds, like the resinous, aromatic, oily compounds, they're not soluble in water. So you got to do things like cook them in fat and then bake them into something in order to get them to actually stay and not separate. But wouldn't it be cool if you could take a plant and breed it so that inside of the leaves, there's all these factories producing water-soluble forms of certain things. This does happen in nature, by the way. If you guys have ever eaten stevia leaves, stevia leaves are about 300 times sweeter than sugar. And if you eat the whole leaf, you'll know what I'm talking about. It just explodes into a sugar. But if you go on Wikipedia and you look up steviol, you'll realize that it's a diterpene molecule. It's actually extremely, extremely similar to CBD. So if you just type in steviol and CBD on Wikipedia and you look at the molecular weights, look at the molecular formulas, look at the molecule too, they're very, very, very similar to each other. The interesting thing about stevia is it's producing this terpene that is not soluble in water at all. And then there's an enzyme inside of the stevia leaf that's basically putting sugar units, one on top and one below, and saying, I'm going to make a sugar sandwich, because the sugar is soluble in water, but this terpene is not soluble in water. So the only way to get the terpene soluble in water is to first fuse the sugars and then bring that whole molecule into water. So now in the stevia leaf, you have this diterpene that's floating around with remarkable solubility in water. You can brew this up into a tea and you will get all of the terpene out in a water-soluble form. This doesn't happen with other plants, which may not have the same enzymes, but it's certainly true that if you took like a pure, CBD, for example, and then you introduced it to this enzyme, a glycosyltransferase enzyme, you would end up with a product that's almost 40 to 50% soluble in water with no carrier required. It doesn't need any oils, doesn't need any emulsifiers, doesn't need any surfactant. It's just a water-soluble form that has some sugars. And it would form a clear solution too. You could look at it and it would be a glass of water, but there'd be 4 ounces of cannabinoids inside of it. You take one shot and you're like, oh boy, here we go.
Dude,
That's
I
the
can't believe people
future.
aren't doing that already, man.
That's the future
I know.
right there.
That's nuts,
Yeah.
man.
Yeah, that's
Wow.
insane.
Dude,
Nick,
well,
you're blowing
speaking
my
of-
mind, brother.
Well, speaking of water, there's one thing I don't know if I asked in the last episode. I should have went back and watched it, man. But watering with carbon-based nutrients, is this something that people can still do within a high-frequency fertigation drip system, let's say? Because that's what everybody's wanting right now, whether it's commercial grow or home grow. They want drip irrigation. They want to feed 13 times a day. They want to get pounds per plant. Again, crop steering. Is this something that you can still do, or is this hand watering or just foliar feeding only would be the best to get those big impacts that you'd want with our plant?
I mean, you can do crop steering. The only consideration is the equipment and how it responds. If you have biofilms and things like that building up, it may create some problems. But as far as like being able to crop steer and feed 13 to 15 times per day using these types of products, you can do that. Personally, I don't think that's the best way to do it. I think you can get better results being more in line with nature, because nature is optimized already. We're just trying to catch up to everything. And rather than overriding what nature naturally does, I think it's better to work within the confines that's been established. So the answer is, yeah, you can use, carbon-based fertilizers to do that. You can also do foliar sprays in conjunction with that. I mean, it kind of depends on how far you let the plants dry back and what the humidity in the air is like, and really what the moisture retention capacity of the soil is. I think for crop steering in particular, people get into VPD as a very important thing, but VPD is just one tiny cross-section of the larger soil plant air continuum, right? You have this thing going on in the soil where the soil holds on to water, and there's a ton of water in the soil, not so much in the air. So if the soil is really wet and the air is really dry, that forces the transpiration pump to happen, right? But if the air is really wet and the soil is really wet, that plant's going to get waterlogged really, really fast. So the point that I want to make about that is when we're feeding carbon to the plants through the feed water, the goal really is to optimize the feed water uptake. We want the air to be dry because that's going to encourage the plants to transpire. It'll create a wicking effect if the VPD is high. it's going to pull moisture out of the plants. And then what we want is a medium that is either within a particular moisture range. So if we're using rock wool slabs, for example, we'll maybe try to set a particular dry back point, and then we'll have our equipment come in and make sure that the medium doesn't get too dry. Or on the flip side, if you're growing in like a living soil in a bed type of setup, you want to also monitor how dry that soil gets. Because at a certain point, what ends up happening is the pressure differentials change. You've got the VPD acting to pull moisture out, but if the soil gets too dry, it's going to create a wicking effect as well. So now the plant's being robbed from both ends. The roots are getting dehydrated and the top of the plant is being dehydrated. So if you guys have ever seen that where the soil is dry and the air is dry, those plants are toast, right? They're crispy. So, how crop steering fits in, I think, in terms of how you use a carbon-based fertilizer, how you feed carbon to the plants while crop steering, I think it has to fit into the soil-plant air continuum. You can't just look at VPD.
This FTS clip was brought to you by AC Infinity, leaders in garden innovation. Use discount code TheStash15 at checkout to save some money on your order.
From the Stash Podcast.